Hello, welcome back to the third video in the Expert Skills Program Self-Study block. You will remember that in the last video we looked at the functional areas of your cortex and how they're used when you think. Now we will look at how the preferential use of one of these areas over the others leads to your learning style. Remember that filling out the study guide during the video helps you get the most out of what you're viewing. The research with personality type indicates that your preferences for how you process information influence how you learn, and more importantly, how you perform on exams. Just to be clear, the personality type referred to in this presentation refers only to that identified by the Myers-Briggs type indicator. The reason for this restriction is that no other personality model matches the functional specialization of the cortex in the way that we require. Understanding your own personality type and the self-awareness that it produces is a critical first step in helping you change yourself permanently into a strong learner. It all hinges on your understanding that a preference for either front or rear brain learning are normal and natural. The goal is to develop the part of your brain that is the hardest to use through deliberate practice. In other words, to achieve balance by developing the skill of your opposite. Now, we can deepen your understanding of just what type is and why it isn't a trait. I want to begin by noting that this video is not a substitute for the SuccessTypes book. Although there is an overlap with this video, the book lays a groundwork that will help you get the most from what I will cover here. If this applies to you, I suggest you stop and read the book. The Myers-Briggs personality type is a mental model of normal differences between people. But like all mental models, it doesn't describe anyone completely. This allows for considerable individuality for those who share the same personality type preferences. These tendencies are unconscious and they do not change once they're established. One example that I like to use with audiences is that of folding your arms. I start by telling the audience that the exercise requires that their arms be folded. Then I tell the participants that the exercise is to fold their arms the other way, the opposite way. This is supposed to mimic the process of becoming aware of your opposite preference. I highlight that point by telling them that the first time they folded their arms, they did so without thinking and, very importantly, without taking away their attention. I point out that the first part of the exercise is unconscious and the second is conscious. Folding your arms your normal way represents your type. It is your comfort zone because it doesn't require thinking and takes very little effort. On the other hand, folding your arms the opposite way represents the opposite to your preference, and it requires that you take your attention away from everything else to make sure you're doing it right. Your awareness of your effort increases. So, folding your arms the opposite way represents your type opposite. This provides you with insight into several aspects of learning. First, your type leads you to learn in your comfort zone because it doesn't require a lot of effort. But when you're required to learn by thinking in your opposite, you find yourself uncomfortable and working hard. It's hard to trust learning this way, and your instinct is to reject it. The other aspect of learning that's illustrated by this exercise is that it goes without question that you can fold your arms both ways. In order to be an effective learner, you must also think in both your type and your opposite. In other words, folding your arms both ways, but with your thinking. However, you'll tend to spend relatively more of your thinking time in your type and less time in your opposite due to the effort involved. If it were not possible to use your opposite, there would be no way to use deliberate practice and no way for you to improve. Now that you have an idea of what it means to prefer a way of thinking, let's take a look at some of the ways that personality type and therefore learning style can be misunderstood. A type indicator does not and cannot measure how much you prefer your type. Instead, it is a sorting instrument that puts you into one of two categories, represent the preference of one over the other. It is important for you to know that if you want to measure how much, then you're measuring a trait, and you're not determining a type. The Myers-Briggs was not designed to determine trait. Because you can measure how much with a trait, you could get a score from 0 to 100 if you had such an instrument. This simple difference has caused many psychologists to mistakenly criticize the Myers-Briggs type indicator as a measure of a trait. Next, Myers-Briggs is not a measure of intelligence. It has more to do with the way you prefer to study. And it also has to do with the type of test you're taking, because sensing types tend to do better with hands-on tests and look more intelligent that way, and intuitive types do better with written tests that require deduction, and they tend to look more intelligent that way. Type is also not a limitation. A person's type does not limit their ability to develop the skill of their opposite. A right-handed athlete, for example, can develop the use of their left hand to improve their overall skill. This is the critical feature of personality type. You have no limits. A close examination of the description of each type preference shows that none are described in negative terms. A positive for one is not matched by a negative for the opposite. Thus, each type has a strength in the way they naturally prefer to think, and they also bring a gift of insight to a person who is their opposite. Finally, it's important to reiterate that personality type is about normal behavior, and it cannot diagnose psychological problems. It's common for those who are learning about type for the first time to conclude that they may be in danger of revealing something about themselves that is defective. The actual outcome is that learning about type teaches you that you're okay. Now, with that brief introduction, let's take a look at how we can view type as a learning style. We will look at a study that showed the academic performance of the 16 types and explain the results in terms of the way the types learn. The research results shown here are from two studies at liberal arts colleges in New England, and one study compares each of the 16 personality types with grade point average. The other study compares personality types with SAT scores. Both studies are plotted for a side-by-side comparison, but not to show any correlation. In fact, the bold line serves a purpose only for visual comparison. The first important finding is that each point is statistically significant from the others. Thus, a student's type affects both GPA and SAT performance, and the question becomes, how does it have this effect? The answer is found in how information is processed while learning. We can evaluate this more clearly by grouping the data to reveal a very important insight into learning style. You can see this in this version of the data, that the students group together as either linear learners or integrative learners. The linear learners all have the S for sensing type in their type designations. The integrative learners all have the N for intuitive type. Also, you can see that the intuitive types perform better on a time standardized test like the SAT. By comparison, a GPA calculation includes more than just exams, so it's more difficult to compare any one type feature with the GPA performance. However, each type performs higher on GPA when they are judging than when they are perceiving. Check this out by locating, for example, the ESFJ and the ESFP types in the lower left of the figure. This might be partly explained by the tendency of judging types to complete their to-do lists on time. But let's look at the more dominant effect of sensing versus intuitive types, the effect that relates to learning style. The intuitive types appear to be smarter since their SAT scores tend to be higher than the sensing types. But the underlying explanation is that intuitive types naturally skip around in their reading because they're looking for relationships and patterns. They look for similarities and differences and alternative ways to group items and terms together. Thus, they prepare for ruling out wrong answers and improving their guesses. This type of study is a learning style because it is easier for them than just reading straight through and memorizing as they read. By comparison, the sensing types are much more comfortable in doing exactly that. They start at the beginning and systematically progress through the material. They don't jump around, and they only memorize relationships when they are described as a fact. For now, we can make the comparison that when study involves integration of concepts beyond what is taught in lecture or in the reading, the performance of intuitive students on multiple choice exams tends to be higher. But there is one big exception to this. When the multiple choice question only asks for fact recall, the sensing types get the advantage. This is what their systematic memorization has prepared them for. While sensing types are mystified and frustrated by questions that require deduction of an answer, that they also do very well on memorization-oriented questions. When you consider that the predominant teaching in pre-medical education is memorization-oriented, the sensing types arrive at medical school believing they know how to learn well enough, and they expect a continuation of the same type of testing. I found that when I was able to help a sensing type student understand what they needed to correct, and then I taught them how to study to achieve that correction, their grades went up. And if you ask them why this works better, you get a very interesting response. They will tell you that they don't really know what has changed, except now they have to read differently and they seem to understand the test questions. In other words, their improved performance is still a mystery to them, but they're hooked on the new methods because they work. There's more to tell about learning style as we look at the neurobiology of learning and the methods involved in upcoming videos. For now, it's important that you remember that this is more about being skilled than about being smart. The students who improve their performance use deliberate practice to upgrade their learning skill so that they would be better prepared for the type of performance that was needed. It was this experience in successfully retraining students to how to learn that was the beginning of SuccessTypes. At this point, it's important to build a deeper understanding of personality type in order to make the best use of the methods that are available to you. First, you will learn how extroverted and introverted behavior is the result of noise in your thinking. The noise is controlled by the part of your brain called the thalamus. We'll then look next at how sensing and intuition preferences result from where you like to spend most of your thinking time. As indicated earlier, the type that unconsciously drives your behavior is determined by which part of your brain you use most often. In the case of sensing and intuition, you will determine for yourself whether you spend more time in the back of your brain or in the front. We will wrap up our discussion of personality type with a brief look at the thinking and feeling preferences and then the judging and perceiving preferences. In order to learn about extroversion and introversion, we'll do a brief exercise that will be familiar if you have looked at the student version of the video that introduces the Expert Skills program. So take a moment to look and reflect on how you do your best thinking. Do you prefer to talk it out to think more clearly? Or do you prefer to think it through so you can decide what to say? Those who prefer to talk first often change their mind as they speak, so you actually hear their thinking process. By comparison, those who prefer to think first do this process silently so that they're more comfortable when they speak. The way you answer is determined by the gain setting in your thalamus. To explain, the gain setting is a volume setting, and it doesn't vary over time. The next slide illustrates the location of the thalamus, which lies between the top of the spinal cord and the brain. Due to its location, all of the sensory input to your brain has to pass through the thalamus. This includes what you hear, see, touch, and smell. The significance of this location is that in order to get enough information for thinking, it must pass through in significant amounts to the cerebral cortex. But students divide out into two groups. One group has a thalamus that lets very little information through. This is called a low gain setting. The other group has a gain setting that is high, which means that it has a lot of information getting through. Now, let's look at how this affects both conscious and unconscious behavior. Here we see that the low gain students talk it out to increase the amount of information getting through. They make direct eye contact. They talk louder and faster, and they're generally more active. In other words, they're extroverts. The opposite is true for high gain students. There is so much input that it is hard to think, so they try to shut it down a little in order to be able to think things through. In other words, they behave like introverts. But as you can see, more is involved than just behavior. Both the response to sedatives and the augmentation of an instrument-measured evoked brain response is given to the response to a given stimulus also is different. For example, if you're an extrovert, you need a lower dose of a sedative since there's less sensory information being transmitted. Similarly, the evoked response to the stimulus is augmented just as your outward behavior becomes more active. So you can see that the function of your brain is affected by your thalamus, and this leads to effects on your study behavior. Low-gain students will get more from study time that involves talking out loud, and high-gain students will need their time alone in order to learn well. More specific advice will be presented to you when we cover the learning methods of concept mapping and question analysis in the last two videos. Our next personality type dimension relates to what you pay the most attention to. If you consider what you give most of your attention to, you will find that you are either more comfortable with specific facts or with relationships that reveal a big picture. Remember that as we look at this preference in learning, everyone does both of these, but they only prefer one. The non-preferred way of giving attention has to be used deliberately. If you're a Myers-Briggs sensing type, you will unconsciously give more of your details to specifics, unless you're asked to do the opposite. Your guiding principle is in finding certainty in what you're learning. If you have to use guessing as a part of your thinking, you'll feel uncomfortable. By contrast, an intuitive type would find guessing to be fun. If you're an intuitive type, you will find facts and details hard to pay attention to, while new concepts will tempt you to stop and anticipate or second guess how they're related. Your time on task is much lower if you're intuitive, and you need to constantly force yourself to stay with the material. However, as you will find out, this tendency to jump around contributes to integrative learning and the ability to answer the more difficult type of test questions. It is easier to grasp this concept with a graphic like that in the next slide. This slide depicts the concept maps that each type would construct. The linear sensing types like maps that are top-down and arranged in linear order. This matches the way they read. Similarly, the integrative intuitive types tend to interconnect concepts because their tendency to jump around helps them discover these relationships. They can just as easily use a linear or a center-out pattern since they're not bound by constructing a map in just a single correct way. We'll emphasize this more in the concept mapping video. If you have a sensing preference, you will likely be steady but slower in your study, and you'll benefit from a long time on task. Your unconscious goal is to be able to recognize information that you're studying, or if you are learning a procedure, to be able to replicate the procedure properly. Keep in mind that a procedure could be represented in a concept map, and it would be in a straight line, with each step following the previous one. If you're more like the intuitive type on the right, a concept map will be a useful tool in creating order out of your chaotic reading. The constant distraction in your study will become more directed by looking for the next concept or fact to go in the map and then drawing the connections. I've had many intuitives tell me that their time on task goes up dramatically when they study this way. The graphic also shows that the same fact can relate to different concepts. This helps intuitives with another of the learning problems. That is, their learning style causes them to ignore facts that aren't needed to form the big picture. By comparison, if you're a sensing type, it will seem that the only thing you're learning are facts. What you've seen here are two ways of giving attention, and that has an effect on the way you take exams. Sensing types, unless they balance their learning, prefer to recognize a memorized answer. If an answer isn't recognized, they try to stimulate recall by reading the question again, but more carefully. They are better at this one-step thinking. After the test, they will complain that some questions are tricky or that it wasn't like this in the notes. By comparison, intuitive types, unless they use balance their learning, will have trouble remembering details. If needed, they can eliminate incorrect answers by comparing against their big picture learning. They are better at 2- and 3-step thinking, and since this type of thinking requires making an educated guess, they can actually score higher than they really know. The secret to taking multiple choice tests is to learn in a way that improves your ability to think about alternatives and relationships. But not all questions are the same on a test. Some questions actually do test memorization, and some test higher order and 2- and 3-step thinking. We can sum up the learning styles of sensing and intuition by looking at the type of questions they do best on. As already mentioned, sensing types will do better on test questions that rely on the back of the brain by emphasizing memorization. Memorization also includes memory of the way facts are organized. This is usually learned directly from the course notes or a textbook. But consider this. Memorization is important because it provides us with a vocabulary that we need to think with, but it doesn't bring us understanding. In the example given, asking for a list of the symptoms of a heart attack, that's a learning task that could be memorized by a high school student. It could be recognized or recited without understanding what it means. In order to test understanding, questions are constructed that require higher order thinking skills. These are the questions that are tricky, or at least to the linear learner they're tricky. But these are the questions where intuitive types perform better. Intuitives create their own groupings when they learn by using the front of their brain to compare relationships between concepts. Then, when taking a test, they can rely on their ability to eliminate incorrect answers that don't fit this big picture. Thus, the example given, asking for an explanation of the causes of chest pain, that requires a considerably greater integration of memory of not only the heart, but of the entire thorax. not to mention an understanding of the relevant physiology. This higher order of learning is called by the acronym Higher Order Thinking Skills, HOTS or HOTS. At this point, it may be starting to make more sense that studying for both memorization and HOTS are needed. But there's a barrier to seeking this balance that I call the personality paradox. The paradox is that the personality type that stands to gain the most from personality theory is the least interested in it. And just to reinforce this characteristic of the sensing type, they tend to avoid learning theory that can help them and study better, but they do prefer that their learning be applied. At this point, we need to briefly consider the remaining two dimensions of personality type. The thinking and feeling preferences ask about how you prefer to make decisions. Thinking types are guided in their decisions by what is logical and objective. Feeling types are guided in their decisions by more subjective judgments. You'll find this aspect of personality type to be of great value in learning how to communicate better, but we won't be referring to it to any great extent in this pre-matriculation video series. As always, it's important to keep reminding you that everyone uses both of these aspects of their personality, but you'll find that one of these preferences is more comfortable to you than the other. Now, we can look at the remaining dimension that influences our tendency to learn by a set plan or to be flexible in our learning. People who prefer to adhere to an organized plan in the way they conduct their daily lives, including the way they study, are called judging types. If you're a judging type, you tend to emphasize the use of your judgment to assess whether you have achieved closure on your goals. Completing to your to-do list, for example, is closure. This makes you very goal-oriented. By comparison, if you prefer to emphasize flexibility and adaptability in your daily life, you are a perceptive type. You're driven to discover more and find more information before completing your study. This willingness to set goals aside, even if you establish goals, makes you very adaptable. As with the other type dimensions, both of these ways of conducting your life are functional and important. But as usual, you'll have an easier time with one compared to the other. Now that you have looked at all four dimensions of personality type, you can gain some insight into how you can use this information to choose a specialty. By way of general background, the Myers-Briggs type indicator itself was validated by correlating the specialty choice of each of the 16 Myers-Briggs types for 5,300 medical students. It's important to remember, as you consider correlations, that there are many exceptions for very valid reasons that have nothing to do with type. Type can help guide you, but it should never compel you. The most general influence of type preferences, the sensing versus intuitive dimension. If you have a sensing preference, your need for certainty can be satisfied in either in performing procedures or in collecting and maintaining data, for example, patient charts. That will direct you into fields like surgery and OB/GYN due to their procedural emphasis, or into primary care due to the patient data emphasis in doing routine histories and physicals. If you have an intuitive preference, you will likely select into diagnostic areas that require interpretation. This will include tertiary care areas, including tertiary care pediatrics. Psychiatry would take advantage of your high capacity for uncertainty. Also, radiology could satisfy your desire to interpret patterns, especially in identifying false positives or negatives. Now, there are a few important additional considerations that we should cover. First, it would be a potentially serious mistake to choose a specialty just because it correlates with your personality type. I have had many enlightening conversations with physicians who have knowingly gone against their type to achieve higher goals, or to achieve their goals differently. An intuitive and feeling type surgeon told me that she found surgery to be satisfying, but not due to the procedures, which would have been true of a sensing type. Instead, it was the uniqueness of each one of her patients that appealed to her intuitive feeling point of view. A sensing type psychiatrist had to go against her discomfort with psychiatry to be able to correct the way the mentally ill were treated in her home country. In these and other examples, the most important aspect of understanding your personality type is that when the specialty that you choose requires you to deviate from one or more of your preferences, you have the insight to accept the compromise. So always remember that type preferences can become learned skills that are developed through deliberate practice. Now, let's recap what we've covered in this video. You've learned that personality type influences the way you prefer to learn. Also, the way you learn influences your performance on tests. Awareness of your learning style allows deliberate practice to be used to strengthen your non-preferred learning skills. Specialty choice will often reflect personality type, since this is the comfort zone for thinking and working, but it can be overridden when needed. In the next video, you will learn how you can influence the way your brain changes when you learn. I look forward to having you join me there.